bat for me today, and I appreciate that a lot. He does so much here at the Farley family, which y'all know a lot longer than I have. There's a place around here in Alabama, one of my favorite locations actually in the entire state. There's few locations that I would describe as magical, but this is one of those. It fills you with wonder. It's a place that is shrouded in mystery and legend, and that is the Talladega Speedway. It brings people together. NASCAR is something else. I have never experienced anything like that my entire life growing up in the West. You hear about it. You know, it's a very stereotypical Southern thing, especially in Alabama. That NASCAR is just, the hype was right. I mean, it did not let us down. So me and my brother went a while back, and we went, and they weren't the cars, there were these trucks. And they were so loud. I mean, these trucks were souped up, and they would race around the track a bunch, and it was a lot of fun doing it, but it was like there was so much wasted potential there because there's these really powerful trucks that race around the track over and over and over again, and there's a lot of excitement that goes to it, but then at the end of the day, they never went anywhere. And the whole time, like you're watching them, the thought never comes into your mind. You never wonder, I wonder where they're going. I wonder where they're off to. Because you can see the loop. You can see the track that they're going on. You know they're going to go in a circle. They're going to go in a circle, and everybody there is just waiting for an accident. They're just waiting for a wreck. That's why you go to watch the NASCAR races. But, I mean, it's a lot of activity that's going on, and there's not a whole lot of direction as far as the journey that they're on. They go, and then they stop. It's a similar situation at Chuck E. Cheese. I've only been there once in my entire life, but I remember there was this white four-wheeler that was it was on this little motor, and you stick those gold coins in with the kind of creepy mouse on the front of it, and you stick it inside there, and the four-wheeler would just like lurch and drive, and it made you feel like you were on top of the world riding that thing. But at the end, the ride was over, you got off, and then you went on your merry way. There's a lot of activity, but not a whole lot of direction there. Some churches can function that way. Some Christians can really function that way too. You know, we're very active. We're doing a lot of things, or a congregation might be doing a whole lot of things, but there's no direction to these things. And so there's a similar reminder that Paul gives to Timothy in his first letter that he writes to him, and that's where we're going to spend our time this evening. So Timothy is a young minister. And Paul has given him some tips and advice. And so even as this first letter opens up, you see that Paul is talking to Timothy about what to look out for, what to be on guard for, and also with the leadership of that church. So the church was still relatively young here. And so we have Paul writing Timothy and saying, look, when you get into verse 3, it says, "As I urged you when you're going to Macedonia, to remain at Ephesus, so that you might charge certain persons to teach, not to teach any different doctrine, or to devote themselves to any myths or endless genealogies which promote speculations, rather than stewardship from God that is by faith. The aim of our charge is love, that issues from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith." We talked about that verse, and there in verse 5 recently here. But what he's talking to Timothy about are the leaders of that congregation, to stay away from certain things. If you read down that list, maybe for us, that's not really a problem in the churches of Christ, right? There's not any leadership really that we know of that struggles with just rambling and citing these long and lengthy genealogies, but the overall message there is not to miss the point. And that goes for churches as a whole, but it also goes for the individual Christian. Don't fill your life with a bunch of activity. Don't dress the part. Don't go to every single event. Don't go to, make yourself as active as possible and then forget the entire point of what it is to be a Christian or to be a part of a congregation. And so he goes on into chapter 2, which is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time here, into chapter 2. And we're going to look at this idea of missing the point, and then we're going to look at the positive side of that, and it is those that get it. Those that get the point do certain things, and it's a very nice flowing section in this chapter here. But those that are missing the point, you see in 1:19 with the leaders there, but the language that's used there is very, it's like a flashing warning sign that you see. He talks about a shipwrecked faith, and it's like this dramatic language that's being used here. And then again in 6 and verse 9, so that's the end of verse 1 or chapter 1. It says, "By rejecting this, some have made shipwreck of their faith." And I don't know what imagery that brings to your mind. Those that have missed the point entirely, that have shipwrecked their faith, what kind of image that brings to your mind? Maybe you think of a ship that's been beached that's just like hit some shallow water and it's just stuck up there. But what comes to my mind is just a bunch of splinters floating in the water. There's a ship that was going along, and they hit a rough patch, and they forgot the point, they forgot the purpose, and then the entire ship just went into splinters. Well, that language is built upon again if you go to chapter 6 and in verse 9, and Paul uses the word to plunge. And I want to look at that for a second just to make that point that Paul's trying to make stand out even more. So when you get down to chapter 6 and in verse 9, it says, "But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation." Those that miss the point fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires. Again, he's building upon that, what he told Timothy in the first chapter about those leaders that are in place. Harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. Again, you have this language that's used here that's supposed to bring this image into your mind. And so you have a shipwreck, splinters in the sea, and then you wonder where are all the passengers at? Who were on the ship? Well, they are plunging to the bottom. And plunges, it's quickly moving in the wrong direction. And so Paul is giving this warning all throughout the book in these very vivid word pictures that he paints. And he says that if you forget the point, if you miss what it's all about, you can shipwreck your faith and you can plunge in the wrong direction. And so then he flips that and starts talking about the opposite. So here's what success looks like. And so after giving this warning about these leadership here and then using this warning about shipwrecking your faith, he begins and says, first of all, then I urge you, it's a petition verb, I urge you that supplications, that prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all people. And that sounds really good. It's one of those verses that you can get on board with when you hear it at first, but then when you start moving into maybe the verse that follows that, or taking apart those verses, those words that he uses, it's almost like he says prayer 4 different times, but with prayers, with prayers, with prayers, and with prayers. Because he uses several different words, but they're all different. And sometimes we read right over those words, like, I urge that supplications, we don't really know what that one is. We go, and prayers, well, that one makes sense to me. Intercessions doesn't make as much sense, and thanksgiving. Okay, got that one. That's what you do before before you eat every meal. There's Thanksgiving. I got that one, and I got the prayer part. But it brings this really cool idea to life here. Supplication is a special need or a special burden that is either on the congregation or is on someone's heart personally. It's a supplication, something that you bring to God that is special. It's a special request that is being made to God. That's the idea behind supplication there. Prayers brings with it the idea of it's those private prayers. And so the difference between the public prayer and that being a substitute for those private prayers. So pray for everybody in public, but also in private. Pray for everybody. Don't leave anybody out. And we'll get back to that in a second. And then intercessions. Intercession is praying on behalf of somebody else. And then you have thanksgiving. It's thanking God for who he is, not just treating him like an ATM or just making this wish list and then sending it up to God and then saying amen. But all of those things sound good. When you break apart the words, and you might have a different translation that kind of, you could already see the idea that was there. But then when you see all people, and then right after it says, for kings who are in high positions, that we might lead a peaceful and quiet life. When you read kings today, we translate that probably immediately to presidents and elected officials. And sometimes those prayers are very easy, and sometimes those prayers are very difficult to pray for all people. But then moving back even to this all people, is there anybody that we deem unworthy of our prayers? Is there anybody that it makes us uncomfortable to pray about? As I was reading down through this text, I was like, oh, there shouldn't be anybody that hard to pray for. And then I started thinking, I was like, about some of the most wicked people in this world that I could think of. And I was like, man, it'd be difficult to pray for that person, or the best outcome for that person, or even for that person to come to a knowledge of the truth, because you're like, you don't deserve to come to the Farley Church of Christ. You are far beyond that. Sometimes that mentality is that there are people who we deem to be outside of the power of prayer. But we see here first that we see that it's a command. So when he uses this petition verb, he says, I urge that these supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving, it's a command. And so we have not only, if we don't like the sound of it, and it's not a suggestion that's being made here. We're going to talk about inspiration in a class coming up here, but it's a command that we have from Paul. Pray for all people, pray for kings who are in high positions, that we lead a peaceful and quiet life. But there's the challenge is for all people and for kings and for leaders, even if we don't maybe agree or think that God can do anything with these people, because there's some that we do write off, but maybe God hasn't written off. And this is such a powerful point coming from Paul. I mean, the Pharisee of Pharisees, and with his background, and with him saying that pray for all people, I wonder if, as he was writing that, if he thought, like, there was a lot of people that didn't think there was any hope for me, and I was not on their prayer list at all. But then look at how Paul turned out. So you see the power of prayer that's in here as well. But then you see this dramatic change. So this is in 2 and verse 2. This dramatic change, that people that get the point can bring about some dramatic change. And so you have, for kings who are in high positions, that we might lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. This is good and pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved, to come to a knowledge of truth there. So what's the point behind all of these different prayers? They might be difficult prayers to pray, but look at the amazing change that can come about. Now, at this time, they were still under Roman rule, and there were a lot of very wicked rulers and persecutions that they were going through, and Paul still believed, if you pray, then you can change the nation. It doesn't matter if you're a president or if you're in politics, but prayer can make a big difference. And the point behind all this, it's a very physical one at first glance. It's pray all of these things so that you can lead a peaceful and quiet life, and you have godly, which is spiritual, and dignified in every way. But it seems very physical, and that's kind of uncharacteristic of Paul. But he's showing the power of prayer, but also of the commands that God gives us. And we've hit this point a few times, that when God gives us a command, it's physically good for us, and it's spiritually good for us as well. But God is showing us how we can change the layout and the landscape of America, but also of no matter what country you find yourself in. And especially right now with so many wars going on and so many things going on in this world, I believe this is a message that needs to be revisited in a lot of different congregations. Okay, so we see this dramatic change that can come out with people that get the point, but we also see that it leads to peace, and that it can actually lead to peace in a world that maybe it seems like that's impossible to achieve. And that's the problem sometimes when we begin to pray to God, is we limit God's power based on what we think that he can do or what he can't do. And we do that in our own personal lives. I've done that several times and think, well, there's the power of prayer. If you pray, God can do anything with you, but you always put a cap on that. Just think about it in your own life and be, okay, but if I wanted to be a vet, I love animals, that's a lot of school. If I prayed, and if I prayed and I really strapped down and did it, if that was God's will, there would have to be some crazy supernatural things going on where to me, be able to make it through all those 14, 15 years of schooling or whatever it is that you have to do to become a vet. But there's a lot of power in prayer, and we shouldn't limit it, and that's what Paul's point is to Timothy here, which is very encouraging for a young man who's working in a congregation like this, is to know that even though you feel young, which I can relate, I know there's a lot of people in here that can relate to that too. You feel young that you can't really do that much or make much of a difference, and, well, that's true, but God can through you and through anybody. All right, we also see that the most important point that Paul makes in all of this, and I've underlined this and circled pretty much every word in this verse, but we see in verse 3 that people that get the point, they please God. Now that's really, you have these difficult commands that are given to pray for leaders, to pray for everybody. Don't leave anybody off your prayer list. But then we see in verse 3, this is good and it's pleasing in the sight of God. So if anything, if it doesn't make sense to you, if we can't piece it together, it's one of those when your parents say, I told you so. We don't really understand why, but we have to because they're our parents. Well, that's kind of where you have this added on to the end of here. If anything, even if it's a difficult prayer, do it because it's pleasing to God. And that could have been all that Paul said. He didn't have to mention anything about a peaceful life or this dramatic change, even in this physical world. He didn't have to add any of that stuff. He could have just said, it would please God for you to pray for all people and the rulers, even if you don't agree with which side of the fence they're on, per se, and then just moved on. But he doesn't. He develops this point here. So people that get it, people that are moving in the right direction, and the people that Paul is trying to help Timothy, help others to become, they get the point and they're pleasing to God. And that's really the end goal of all of this. And here in 1 Timothy chapter 2, but maybe think about for a second one of the most difficult commands that you think is in the Bible. Maybe it's one that's personal to you, one that you think is very difficult to follow because it's something maybe you struggle with, or it's something that's in your past that kind of shapes your mentality or your mind towards those things. And just remember that if it's God's will, if it's something that God wants you to do and it pleases Him, then that's going to bring about all the good, and that's really the only reason that we need to do and follow through with those commands in the first place. We started with those 4 different words that talked about prayer, the power that we have of them. It says pray for all people, and maybe we have those people in our mind that come to mind that we think, I don't really want to pray for that person, but then you see the power that comes from it. So if there's something that you struggle with tonight, if there's something that's in your life that's keeping you from God, then remember the power of prayer. If it can change an entire nation, if it can change the landscape, if it can calm down wars, if it can change a world, then don't you think it can help you in whatever you're dealing with in your life? If there's something that you're struggling with or something that we can pray for you, then why not come right now as together we stand and as we sing.